I never minded my job as a custodian. I don't know why the job gets a bad reputation. If you don't mind cleaning up messes, the pay really isn't bad, and the hours are consistent. That being said, always be aware of where you get hired to clean and who you work for, because sometimes you will find some truly horrible things. I've been working for this cleaning company in Chicago, and we mostly worked out of office buildings. I was tasked with cleaning for this company that was supposedly in the shipping industry, and I was the only custodian in the entire building. My job was to come in at night after the building closed and the workers were gone, and I would vacuum, refill the water coolers, and basically maintain the building. For the most part, this was a decent job, and it got me home after about 6 hours a night. It's too bad the company was bogus. You see, on what ended up being my last night cleaning the building, I showed up to my shift. It was empty as usual, so I let myself in and got my supplies ready. As I began pushing my cart down the hallways, I noticed that the big conference room at the end of the hall had all its lights on. The blinds were closed, so I couldn't see inside, but I could tell the light was still on. I figured it was nothing, and since it was at the end of the hall, I would work my way down to it and turn the light off after cleaning the room. So I began vacuuming out of the offices and working my way down the hallway. As I got closer and closer to the conference room, this really horrid smell began to fill the air around me. In my head, that meant that someone had something bad for lunch, and that it had been sitting in the trash can somewhere for me to find and dispose of. I wish that was the case. As I got closer and closer to the conference room, the smell began to overpower everything else, including the smells of my cleaners. I reached out to the door of the conference room and swung it open, and right away, I knew where the smell was coming from. Inside the room was the 4 owners of the business, all of which were sitting in their chairs, face down in a pool of blood on the conference table. I ran out of the room and called the police. I had never seen anything like that before. It would turn out that each of the men died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, and when the investigation was over, rumors began circulating. It was being said that the owners of the company had ties to the cartel, and the shipping company was more than what it looked like on the surface. It was never made public what happened, but most of the people who know about it have said that the company was into some shady business and ended up being executed for it. I put in my resignation that day and ended up working for a different company that cleans houses. It's a bit more personal, but overall I feel like I'm less likely to run into something as traumatizing as that ever again. At least I hope so. I held multiple different job positions throughout my 8 years working for the pastry factory back when I lived in Wisconsin. The one that I hated the most, without a doubt, the chief engineer. Not that it wasn't a nice job with a fancy title, but because the factory was full of old machines. They broke down all of the time, which meant I spent most of my nights there on my hands and knees, underneath or sometimes inside these giant death traps, trying to fix whatever was wrong with it. I'll never forget the night that one of the industrial line ovens broke down. You see, the factory had been fitted with 8 industrial ovens that spanned about 15 feet long, and a conveyor belt would run through them with pastries riding along on top of it. And as the pastries passed through the oven, they would go in raw and come out the other side about 10 minutes later hot and ready to go. So whenever one of the ovens would break down, it was an emergency because everything else on the line had to stop until it was fixed. That night, I was the only engineer on site, so I was called to the floor to inspect the oven. And right away, I could tell that one of the components that hooked up to the heating coils was fried. It was the most common issue with those ovens. The hard part was telling exactly where down the line the issue was. To find that out, I had to crawl underneath the oven as it was turned on and trying to find the section of the oven that wasn't heating up as much, and from there, I could replace the part. It wasn't a hard job, it was just tedious, so I lowered myself down as the oven began to heat up, and in no time I found the area with the faulty part, which was near the part of the oven where the pastries came out at the end of the process. We then turned the oven off. I gave it about 20 minutes to cool down enough for me to get to work, and in no time the faulty piece was out and I was beginning to install the new part. As I had my hand inside of the oven and began to make sure everything was hooked up properly, when all of a sudden I felt something clamp down on my wrist. A metal bar on the inside of the oven had shifted loose and wedged itself on top of my wrist, pinning my hand inside of the oven. I tried not to panic and began to flag down one of the people working on the floor for help. I waved my free hand and he took it the wrong way. He thought I was giving him the go-ahead to turn the oven on and make sure everything was working properly. The issue that he didn't know was my hand was trapped. As I heard the oven kick on, I began to freak out. I started yelling for help and pulling on my arm as hard as I could. You would be amazed at how fast those ovens heat up. Within seconds, I could feel my hands starting to burn, and the metal around my arm was getting hotter and hotter. The worker who saw me panicking came running over, and when he saw the situation, he was in horror. I began to scream as the searing pain surrounded my right hand. He ran to the other side of the oven as fast as he could and slammed the emergency off button, and then he ran back to me. He yelled for another worker to call an ambulance as we tried everything we could to get my hand out of the oven. After pulling as hard as we could, I finally felt a shift in the metal, and my arm slid out of the oven easily. I ended up with significant nerve damage in that hand, but thankfully, I am still able to move my fingers a bit and still maintain function. Working the night shift at a gas station, you tend to see some characters. Most of them are night owls who are relatively harmless, but every now and then, you get a visitor in your store that seems like they could be dangerous. I'll never forget an encounter I had with a man when I worked at the Exxon Mobil gas station in the town next to mine. I had worked there for about a year at that point and was pretty used to the weird people I would see. There was one day that made things a lot less comfortable for me though, and it resulted in me talking to the police. You see, I was working my shift, and it was just after 1 a.m. It was a slow day. Just a few people had stopped for gas, and most of them paid at the pump, so I was mainly just enjoying time in the store by myself. That was until a man came in and made his way back to the beer cooler. At first, I didn't think anything about it. Most of the people who came in at night who didn't get gas got beer. However, when I noticed what the man was wearing, I got a bit on edge. I noticed that his t-shirt had multiple tears in it, and when he turned back toward the register, I could see the front of his shirt and jeans had brownish red stains on them. Now, I try not to judge people who came into the store. Everyone is living their own life, but there was something off about this guy. As he made his way to the counter with a single 40-ounce bottle of beer in his hands, I couldn't help but notice his eyes. They were covered in bloodshot veins, and his upper lip kept twitching. He put the beer on the counter and locked eyes with me, so I asked him if that would be everything, and he didn't say a word, so I figured that was all he wanted, and I told him the total. I don't know if he could tell that I thought something was off with him, but he just stared at me and slowly took a step backward. I told him the total of the beer again and asked him if he wanted a bag with that. But again, there was no answer. Now I was really getting uneasy. I knew something was up, and I couldn't handle it anymore. I took the beer off the counter and told the man that I needed him to leave the gas station before I called the police, and that was when he began to move to the door, all without breaking eye contact with me. But instead of opening the door, he went to turn the lock. I knew how serious the situation was at this point. I pretended to reach for something under the counter, hoping that he would think I was reaching for a gun. As luck would have it, he did, and he quickly unlocked the door and sprinted out of the store. I immediately called the police, and to my surprise, there was an officer at the gas station in less than a minute. After I told him about the man with the stains on his clothes, he told me about something horrible that happened that same night. Apparently, the reason the police got there so fast was that they were already out on a call. They found a man's body on the side of the road. He had been stabbed multiple times, but police managed to find pieces of ripped clothing near the body. They believed that it belonged to the killer, and they believe that whoever it was the man in my shop just a few minutes before. I showed the officers my security footage and told them the direction he ran. I don't know what would have happened had he not been scared by me reaching under the counter. If he had called my bluff, he would have quickly learned the only thing that I kept under the counter was the bathroom key. I probably wouldn't have made it out of the store that night.